found a really useful way to think about DevOps comes by looking at some definitions from some leading technology companies. So Amazon defines DevOps this way. DevOps is the combination of cultural philosophies, practices, and tools that increase an organization's ability to deliver applications and services at high velocity. Atlassian, which is the maker of Jira and Confluence, they say DevOps is a set of practices, tools, and a cultural philosophy that automate and integrate the processes between software development and IT teams. And then Gartner defines it this way. DevOps represents a change in IT culture, focusing on rapid service delivery through the adoption of agile lean practices. So what you'll notice is that there's a common thread across all three of these definitions, and that is this focus on culture. If you listen to the very first opening keynote between the DI and the SI CIOs, they talked a lot about culture. And so really, DevOps can be viewed as an outgrowth of Agile. Agile brought this idea of making small incremental changes in the software development lifecycle. And DevOps comes along to answer how. How is that done? How do we go about doing that? A useful way to think about DevOps is through this other quote from Amazon, which says, in a similar way that physical goods companies transformed how they design, build, and deliver products using industrial automation through the 20th century, companies in today's world must transform how they build and deliver software. So you can think of the 20th century as scaling and building up production and physical goods. Now, in the 21st century, we're all working in a software world. Now, business is all about figuring out how to scale up and develop and increase the efficiency of software delivery. And that's what DevOps does. The next slide will show you kind of where we were when we started our DevOps journey, which was back in 2018. And we had transitioned our service in this Siemens Energy org of 9,000 users. There were 9 Agile teams. They were all had their own product owner, their own backlog, their own Scrum meetings, and they were building and developing their own changes. We had successfully transitioned to Agile, and there were dedicated QA resources. There was a good backlog grooming process. And so the Agile process was solid. However, there were some challenges. And on the next slide, what you'll see is, and what I want to highlight is just the complexity of what was required for a developer to deploy a change. Everywhere you see the clock symbol is a non-development activity. So developers would make their changes in a development environment, and then they had to build change sets, upload their change set, deploy it to the next environment. And each of these things had a waiting time. And initially, this was okay, because when we started doing complex development, we didn't have that many developers, say less than 10. By the time we got to the end, there were and implemented our DevOps process, there were over 50 developers who were all doing this process. And so that compounded and really didn't scale from a standpoint of complexity, especially because whenever a deployment would occur between environments, the entire org would be locked. If you have 50 developers who are trying to make a deployment at the same time, then it becomes really difficult and challenging to coordinate that. Additionally, you would also see here, our environment chain was only 3 deep. So we had dev, then UAT, and production. There was a lacking of a merge environment. And so there was big problems with things coming into conflict in the UAT environment. On the next slide, I'll highlight this in a larger way to show you exactly why this became an issue. So as I mentioned, there were 9 teams. And the first thing that the teams would do, of course, is they would develop in the dev orgs. They each had their own dev org, and they would go develop in dev, except for one team who decided, no, I don't want to do that. We don't have our data in dev, so we're going to just develop right in the UAT environment. Second, these teams would deploy all of their changes through change sets into the UAT environment. Now, you have to actually multiply each of these lines by 3 to 4, because this isn't just one development activity or one deployment per team. This is actually one deployment per person, because the developers were packaging and deploying all of their own changes through the UAT environment. So you can already tell here that the UAT environment was extremely volatile and really became untrustworthy. The third step, of course, was that each of the developers would individually deploy to production. Now, this caused a lot of problems. There were many challenges that we faced, and here's a list of them. The teams were in silos. There was no coordination, and they were developing independently. There were overwrites of shared metadata all the time, and it caused a lot of frustration. The UAT environment was volatile, so the customers, the business would sometimes say, well, it doesn't work in UAT. It worked yesterday. It doesn't now, but just go ahead and deploy it to production, and maybe it'll work there. Not a situation that you want to be in. All of the deployments were manual. There was no way for us to automate any of it. We had reached the ability to do to do any kind of automation, we capped out everything that we could do because we were stuck with these GUI-based manual processes. There was no versioning of metadata. There was no conflict detection. There was no merging capability. And as I mentioned, UAT was unpredictable. We couldn't automate. We couldn't trace anything. So it was a bad situation. And the interesting thing here is this: despite all of that, despite all these challenges, there was a sense of relative stability. The org was running. There were not major crises. The problem was that all of these challenges were being absorbed by the development team and really were invisible. These were invisible challenges that were just being held all within the development team, since sometimes it'd spill over into the business when they saw that things weren't working right. But underneath, it was obvious that we were not able to scale and we couldn't grow. And so on the next slide, you'll see, that we had to face the need to change. It became clear among the IT leadership that the time had come for us to take our next maturity step. So we had hit our limits. We were not able to improve anymore. There was a lot of frustration with deployments. We couldn't scale our process any further. So this was an issue, and we knew that we needed to address it. And so and another thing that's important to mention on this slide is that the fact that the developers were all individually deploying their own changes meant that we had over 50 people with production deployment access. So this was also a security-related problem. When you are trying to align to information security and legal compliance requirements, that's a major issue to have that many people with production access. And so we knew that we had to change something. So the first thing that we did is we imagined a better process. We sat down and thought through what is it that we can do that can be different. And we sought to bring some improvements that we knew would change things. We wanted to align all the teams on the same process. We wanted to introduce quality gates into the deployment process. We wanted to make sure that all metadata moved through deployments, that developers weren't making manual changes in environments anymore. We wanted to introduce source control and versioning. We also knew that we needed to have a dedicated merge environment so that conflict resolution was definitely happening. And then we also had to, for security reasons, as I just mentioned, we had to reduce deployments to fewer people. Now, in order to make this work, we also had to define new roles. The roles of a developer had to change. We had to tell the developers, you're going to have to deploy to Git. You're going to have to self-deploy to QA, this new environment, and you're not going to deploy to UAT in production anymore. That responsibility is taken away from you. The idea here is keep the developers focused on what they do best, which is developing and then telling you what they developed, which is this initial packaging of their deployments, or, in DevOps terms, a commit of changes. And so this focus was develop and commit, and then the rest is passed off to another team. We also had this role of release manager, who would then take over the responsibility of doing the deployments and coordinating the deployments instead of having individuals do deployments. So they would coordinate with the developers and be a first point of contact for any issues. They would do the UAT and production deployments and also enforce the quality gates at each step. This other role emerged, which we honestly didn't plan for, but became very obvious and important that it was needed, which is this DevOps architect role. So it was impossible. It was required for somebody to understand the whole tool chain, to drive adoption in the teams. They had to champion the change, and they had to support the release managers. However, the results were positive over the long term. And the developers, on the next slide, as you'll see, they learned the new process. They gained confidence over time. And so this issue improved. We were able eventually to get away from having 6 release managers to a single release team doing joint deployments and scheduling and coordinating across all the Agile teams. And we established a platform where we could expand and grow and build new functionality like automated static code analysis and more feature-full conflict resolution, proactive conflict detection, which was not possible before. And then DevOps started to become the norm. It started to become the driver of the conversation. And it was how can we improve, not why is Capado so awful or why are we having so many issues with our deployments. So that was the initial implementation in our the brownfield Siemens Energy org. The first step is recognizing the need to change. The second is adopting a DevOps culture. Remember, the definition of DevOps is primarily a cultural one. The third is defining the right goals from the beginning, which is important. Fourth is preparing for challenges. And fifth, not to get overwhelmed, to truly take the Agile approach, start small, crawl, walk, then run. So the first of these steps is recognizing the need to change. And I think that can be summarized simply by saying you can't solve a problem that you don't see or understand. And I know this was an issue for us. I remember our business product owner at one time would say to us, David, you're helping the business implement and improve our processes all the time. Why isn't IT ever improving their processes? And it was a good question. I didn't have an answer to that. And of course, eventually we did, as we've just covered now. But you have to understand that your processes are not ideal and can be improved in order to be able to know to improve them. And then to start the improvement process, you have to understand what your process is. So you need to review it, create a process map, interview everyone involved, and identify what the pain points are. Look for inefficiencies and bottlenecks in your process. Second, what you need to do is you need to adopt a DevOps culture. You don't achieve DevOps when you've implemented a specific tool chain. Honestly, if DevOps is a culture, you achieve DevOps simply by inculcating the culture in the people who are in your Agile team. So you can start the DevOps journey just by starting to talk about a change in mindset. Collaboration. We need to make sure that we're working on collaboration. We need to look at things that can automate, that can be automated, and automate them. We need to look at how we can achieve continuous integration. If we're not using source control, the first step there might be to implement source control. That was the first step for us. And then continuous delivery. How can we actually get to a point where our changes are such that they're in a pipeline where we can just put our hand on the faucet and open or close it? The goal here is to start having everyone in the Agile team start thinking towards these goals and to have that culture become embedded in the team. The third step is defining the right goals. Now, here are some examples of goals. These are the goals, honestly, that I wish we had started with in our original implementation. Unfortunately, our implementation kind of ended up being reactive. And so we weren't as proactive as I think that we ideally would have been. And there is huge benefit in defining the right goals very clearly out front, getting buy-in from the team, which also goes into developing that culture, and then putting everybody, putting this North Star of goals in front of everyone and saying, let's march towards that. Let's implement this. But I think that the important goals that I would have put forward at the beginning of our project, and I think are applicable to just about any DevOps implementation, would be here, which would be being able to identify defects earlier in the development process, decreasing the amount of time developers spend deploying, allowing them to focus on building new things. Third, and very important, is to create a platform to enable future scaling. You can't scale if you don't have the ability to automate. If you don't have a platform that will enable you to automate, then you're going to hit scaling limits. Another thing that's been discussed in this Agile conference and in the recent history, and now in this coming year for SI, is this idea of fit for scale. We have to be able to enable distributed DevOps. How do you enable distributed DevOps? You have to have a platform that can actually support it, and you have to have a process that is on top of that platform that can then be executed on. And so DevOps is part of what brings that to bear. Also, increasing security is important. And like I mentioned, if you have manual processes, inevitably you're going to have too many people with their hands in the pie. And DevOps is one way to be able to enforce security without slowing down the velocity of changes. The next slide, I want to go over the challenges that we had, because I think preparing for challenges is important. I will also say that I think all of these challenges can be overcome and addressed by defining the right goals up front, but the challenges, I think, will still arise. There's a challenge of time, which is that if you're delivering a service, you're focused on delivery. What's the next thing the business needs? It can be very difficult to find a way to step back and realize, hey, we need to change and improve. The cost, there can be a tendency to see DevOps investments as not, especially if you're working in an internal IT service, and maybe there's a cost-sensitive nature of everything that the IT development team is doing. There can be a lot of pressure to spend money on developing a new tool chain. And you have to overcome that by looking strategically at how costs will be lower over time through the increase of quality, through the reduction of defects. And that's an important, very important aspect, and also something that can be difficult to overcome. There certainly is uncertainty in developers and the fear about change and frustration. And that was something that we experienced. And there are going to be detractors who just don't see it as necessary and think that things shouldn't change. And I think that all of these things can be overcome by defining the right goals up front. And finally, this is the last slide. Thank you for sticking with me for this long. Don't get overwhelmed. It can be overwhelming to think of going from where you are to having a DevOps process. Like I mentioned, it starts with culture. So that's the first step. And then just looking at your process and getting alignment in your team would be the next step. Just take the smallest next step. and take a crawl, walk, run approach. Don't look at where you need to be when you're running and be overwhelmed by it. Just take the first step in the spirit of Agile. Stabilize, gather feedback, use an MVP approach. So define an MVP. Here's the smallest thing that we can do that would actually create value. Make a plan and execute on it. And then create a backlog. Keep improving, and don't be afraid to start small. So again, you need to crawl first, then walk, then run. And that's the right approach to tackle something as complicated as DevOps.